work into that. So for instance, if I'm to go over to this page now and talk about this up here. So if I was to draw another, and I think I've actually done this a couple times already, it's kind of hard to draw about these things without at least covering it more than once. The thing about, okay, so we have our up plane here, and we have our down planes here. I'm just going to put a DP here. And you have your closest corner here again. This one's kind of even, kind of like an isometric one. I talked about the shading from the down plane to the up plane in 9 when we were using charcoal. And if you look at that description that I have on the other page, and it's going to talk about the darkest closest to the lightest, and I was also discussing that, I think, when I was using the charcoal. So you see, if you make these the same, first of all, what you have is an up plane and a down plane difference, and that's great. We talked about that already. Now, how do you differentiate between these two? Well, one has to be darker than the other. Also, they should be darker as they get closer to the top. Now, how that traditionally is, well, not traditionally viewed, but how it is viewed optically by your eye is that wherever a darker area is next to a light area, it will appear darker. And that's because your eye is trying to focus on, it's like a little lens, and it has trouble, well, not trouble, but it has to make compensation for things, and it'll see a contrast here. But if you were to look here, you would not see any contrast. So then your retina changes to the amount of light it lets in. And of course, this is dependent on a lot of other things. But so when you're illustrating something or drawing something, it's really important to emphasize that phenomena, that optical phenomena. Okay. Now here, it's like, well, also the things that are always closest to you are darker. So you notice how the closest corner I'm making darker also. Now you say, well, how am I going to do that over here? Well, this is generally considered a secondary plane unless, secondary down plane, unless it's depending on how the light is lit, you know, and whether it's lit evenly or not. I mean, if the light just perfectly lined up with the corner, you might get a similar thing on both sides. Sometimes when you draw, you have to emphasize certain things. And here's an example here. If you look at the student work that's in your book, you'll notice how there's shadows, and that person was doing exactly what I was talking about up here, you see. And you notice how there is some big changes from here to here. And there's changes from here to here, and from this side to this side, because every plane has to show up differently from the one next to it. And sometimes you'll get light reflections and other things, which we'll talk about later. But the idea is that you have to separate planes without using lines, and that's something we started right away, all the way up into lesson 1. And when we did that value scale, we had the same thing, and I said don't put lines between the values. Well, that's why. So what I'm trying to do is I'm still building this a little bit, and I see where this side, I'll make it a little darker. Okay, now when you get to an area like this, you'll notice that what I did in your book is, instead of putting lines there, 2 lines, I actually did a light shading back here and let it come up to the front. Now if you'll notice what happened in this student example, all of these top shapes are silhouetted by darker background shapes. I see one right here where they used a line. Now in a place like that, you probably would have wanted to shade that a little darker. Now you'll run into that a lot in this project here. So the idea is to silhouette by making darker background against lighter objects rather than outlining them, okay? In the case, so to have a white background with a white top is really very difficult. And if you look at everything and you can see it, if anything you can see in the real world, if you can see it, then there is a change in the value. If you can't see it, then it's the same. So if you see the change here from here to here, there is not a line there. Something has to be darker than something else. So something has to be, or there wouldn't be any contrast, because these are not line drawings. Okay, now there's a shadow line there, and we'll talk a lot more about shadows in upcoming lessons. So right now, you should just have fun with it and just try some cast shadows. Basically, the anatomy of shadows can be done in perspective very accurately. And that is in your book. But for right now, what we'll just talk about is usually they project out this way like this, away from the object. And usually they will get softer, the edges get softer as they get farther out, because basically what's happening is the closer it is to the object, the more of it's in focus. You know what I mean? It's almost like being in focus. So it's actually a little sharper, and then as it gets farther away, it gets more diffused. The other thing about shadows is that if you have a light here and this is darker, again, your eye will appear to see this a little darker right here than it does in the middle, because there isn't the contrast for your eye to be working over time. So it'll tend to look darker right where it has a lighter area to it. Okay? So I think we've covered everything in drawing with light, and we talked about our project. So that's it for this lecture then on the vocabulary for lesson 11.